Operation Domination is underway. The ultimate game plan to dominate your NFL experience. With your hosts, Dan Mader.
But what's more impressive to me about the
Case Thornton.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta get
Chris Dowhouse.
Get him, Chase. Get him, Chase.
And Adam.
No,
LaRue.
not necessarily, but it's the same.
Don't hope to win. Be great and dominate.
Yeah, buddy. It's time for another edition of Operation Domination. Thanks for tuning in live on the YouTube channel, Fantasy Football Advice Network at FF Advice. We're also live on X and on Facebook too. Make sure you hit us up on your favorite podcast app by downloading Operation Domination. Wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave a comment, review, download, subscribe, all those great things. I'm your host, Dan Mader, joined here with my only partner in crime for right now. We'll see if we get the other guys in later, but we got Mr. Chris Dowhower in the building. Chris, how you doing? And what are we talking about tonight?
I'm doing pretty good, Dan. I'm trying to get myself excited about the schedule. We're getting to that part of the season right now where we're not into the training camps yet, but we're not really, out of the off season yet. So that's where we're going to kind of dive into tonight. And we're going to have a special edition of our offensive observations from this off season edition. So it's going to be a show long segment that we are going to kind of get into the nitty gritty of what, scores points stand, but also making our points.
I love it. It's going to be fire all the way through. Don't worry, we're going to have Adam in just a few minutes, but yes, it's time. It's time to do it, Chris. So let's go ahead and hit our very first segment on the board.
Tradition of Festivus begins with the airing of grievances.
The Festivus for the rest of us. Gotta love that episode, actually.
One of the best ever, isn't it not? But Dan, sometimes on offense, you got to air it out to score points. And in this case, we're going to air something out. So we're airing our grievances out. We're going to talk about some of the things from last season and this off season that we need to get off our chest or bring to your attention. So let's go ahead and get started. And we'll start off with some of the things that, we have to get off our chest or express our dissatisfaction or just let them know how much disappointed us last season, I should say.
Absolutely. So what's the first category?
Or what we're looking back at the last season, then we want to close out this last season and get into the new season when you were getting that old, dirty juju off us, and who needs to be shamed as we push forward into this new season.
So this one was a bittersweet area for me going into last year. I was so big on Garrett Wilson going into last season. I had him as a wide receiver 6, one of the highest people in Fantasy Pros who ranked him there. Very excited, right? Primed for a second-year breakout. Nobody else has shared targets with. Supposed to have gotten the upgrade at the quarterback position in Aaron Rodgers, and of course, he goes down in 4 snaps, and the rest kind of lived in history. But in a way, I don't want to come down on it too hard because, as frustrating as it was, as many shares that I had of Garrett Wilson, in a way, I was vindicated. Garrett Wilson was 4th in targets amongst wide receivers, had 100 receptions last season. The problem was he had 6.2 yards per target. That was the second lowest mark amongst all receivers with 100 receptions or 100 targets or more. And of course, combine that with the lack of touchdowns because the Jets offense didn't score period last season, it dragged Garrett Wilson all the way down, the wide receiver 39 on a points per game basis in half-point PPR leagues. So that left a very, very sour taste in my mouth. And that was the big depressing thing about last season for me because I was so big on Garrett Wilson and I was right, but I wasn't right at the same time.
That's a tough one when you feel like you got it, but it just slips out of your hands. And Aaron Rodgers didn't help that case at all. Yeah, for myself, Dan, I'm going to go with, I was disappointed in the scoring. We didn't have a lot of scoring last year. I was disappointed in some of the offensive play, and we're talking about offenses. But overall, this guy has been an offensive genius, returning to the game, going to, bring back the Denver Broncos to prominence. Sean Payton, I have a grievance with you. I cannot believe you spent a year off doing what and learning what this offseason or the past season to bring to that Denver offense. We watched Russell Wilson, I guess, had okay stats. I know fantasy-wise he did okay, which is a fantasy show. but oh my God, it was painful to watch. We watched the Bronco team on top of it that was supposed to be competitive at the end. They didn't really accomplish. They didn't go to playoffs. They weren't competitive for most of the season. And on top of it, they didn't want to play any of the rookies. They didn't play any of their players. Marvin Mims goes out there and has a great game. Well, to the bench you go, buddy. Sean Payton, I don't know what happened to you, but my grievance from last season, I hope it changes this season. I was hoping to get more better coaches into this offensive game and get excited, but man, it was painful last year.
You're preaching to the choir on this one. You're not going to get an argument out of me. I'm the one guy sitting here saying that I still believe when it's all said and done, and maybe it's a bold take at this point, I don't know, I don't care, that Justin Fields is going to be the starter week 1 because I believe Russell Wilson is cooked based on what we witnessed playing on the field last year. His stats, I mean, Chris, you like to make this comparison all the time. What's the difference between his stats and when Carson Wentz got borderline run out of the league when he left the Indianapolis Colts? It was basically the same thing, but it looked like horrible football. Why do people think just because he's getting paid $1 million on a contract, why do people think Russell Wilson is still a top-notch quarterback? He is not. That offense was in the bottom third in expected passing. Sean Payton did everything he could in the book to make it as simple and conservative and safe as possible, a la Javonte Williams, who's still coming off of a multi-ligament knee injury, falling forward for 3 yards every first and second down, and that's all we could witness because, God forbid, you put the ball in Russell Wilson's hands. He wouldn't even do it until the fourth quarter, and they were down by a couple of scores. So all of this backs it up. Russell Wilson, I don't care about the stats. Sean Payton did his darndest to make sure he couldn't ruin anything. But then to your point, we go back to the Sean Payton side. And when you go and draft a guy like Bo Nix, who's known in college for just being a check down maestro, it feels like nothing's going to change. I mean, I look at Bo Nix, I look at his actual draft grade, where he should have actually been taken, not in the first round. I don't know what the difference between him and a Jarrett Stidham is. What's the difference other than draft capital now? You're 100% preaching to the choir on that one.
Yeah, Dan, I'm just, for me, we always like to clamor up the show about how important coaching is. And when you have a guy who's supposed to be an offensive genius and you watch the offense Denver play last year, it just does not match up.
What about this comment we got coming in from Rockstar Rips here? He's advocating on Russell Wilson's behalf here. Clearly the Steelers fan. Sean Payton wasn't worried about Russ. He tried to get him waived for no injury clause. Russ stunk. If he actually played well, they wouldn't be trying to ride him out of town. And here's another hint for you. No team pays a quarterback or any player $40 million to play against them. Nobody does that in the NFL. This is not baseball. So if you think he actually wasn't worried about Russ, you missed what happened last year completely. That's my take. What about you, Chris?
Yeah, I don't disagree. Look, I mean, Russ had decent stats like we talked about, but they did everything in their power to hide him. And like I said, I do put a lot on Sean Payton as well. He's got to take some onus. You got to play players who are productive, and he was refusing to do that. He was looking for ways not to score points. It felt like it was painful, like I said, watching on the offense last year. And Russ, I don't think he has a whole lot in the tank. But as a Steelers fan, look, Dan, we got to give them up. We got to throw them a bone. They've had a total of 10 touchdown passes at the quarterback position the last 2 years.
You guys.
So it could look awesome to them.
That's what happens when you don't have Kenny Pickett around anymore. Oh, man. Chris, what was our next topic here?
So you kind of dove into our topic because I talked about my coach that I disappointed from last season. But coaching hires, let's look back at the offseason. We just started off this kind of movement to this new season. It starts with the coaches. What was something from the coaching hiring that stands out to you that you need to share your grievance with?
Yeah, so this one, I'm incredibly disappointed with the Washington Commanders. I was a little bit hopeful here that new ownership, maybe a new organizational direction, and it feels like they kind of just doubled down on what we just seen for the last few years. I mean, you brought in Ron Rivera as a defensive coach who was already a retread, and you just followed that up with new ownership and did the exact same thing with Dan Quinn, a retread, defensive-minded head coach, when you're taking him and bringing him in at a time in which you knew you were going to be in position to draft a franchise quarterback. Now you can say all you want, like, well, we're bringing in Cliff Kingsbury to be an offensive coordinator because that went so well in Arizona. That was such a prolific thing. I mean, from a fantasy standpoint, it's going to be a different conversation when it comes to Jaden Daniels. But if we're looking at this just from like an NFL coaching move, I'm just very disappointed when it comes to the Washington Commanders because this feels like more of the same when it was supposed to be different.
Yeah, you got Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson. You got weapons in this offense. You were hoping to see kind of unleashed the creative mind, head coach. But what we might see a lot of point scores against this defense because last time we saw Dan Quinn on the sidelines, he was getting blown out by Green Bay in the playoffs. So for myself, the coaching thing that stood out to me, Dan, is you're talking about building culture, getting excited. You know, I was so excited for the Raiders. They bring in a coach who I feel like epitomizes what they are. Antonio Pierce was a fantastic hiring. But the part that just kind of just took the air out of me was watching them hire Luke Getsy. This guy could not be less creative than what we saw in Atlanta with Arthur Smith or what we saw in Pittsburgh. Sorry, Pittsburgh fans, again, I'm not trying to shit all over you, but it's just, the offense was pathetic most of that year last year, watching Matt Canada. But even Matt Canada might have emotion, might do something once in a while, Dan. Luke Getsy as a Raider offensive coordinator, took the wind out of my sails, and I was disappointed in the Raiders in that move.
I mean, the only silver lining, I guess, is that, of course, he has the history there with Devontae Adams. That's the only thing you can kind of point to as to why that might be the case. And I would say, well, you don't have a running quarterback. You have a different type of quarterback. Maybe the system's a little bit different. But when you walk away, unfortunately for them, with nobody in the draft to show for it, and it's Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell, who are, again, talk about Denver having the same quarterback. Raiders really have the same quarterback and two guys there. I don't think it can be prolific, even if you were Sean McVay necessarily. So that's where it kind of just throws everything in a cold bucket of water for me, where fantasy wise, I look at that situation, it's going to be all about just volume. I know Adams is going to get volume. I know Zamir White's going to get volume, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be creative. It's not necessarily going to be efficient. It's not necessarily going to be a top 15 scoring offense. So ultimately ceilings are going to be limited, and Luke Getsy does nothing for you. I agree with you there. And I don't know philosophically if he actually fits Antonio Pierce too. So yeah, I tend to agree with that one. Wasn't super thrilled about that either.
Yeah, and just to kind of tap it off for me is, when you look at what he kind of does, this guy, didn't want to utilize Justin Fields' legs. Not that they have those kind of legs in the Raiders quarterback play, but you want a guy who's going to try to put you in position to succeed. Raiders have offensive players. If you give me Devontae Adams and you give me Brock Bowers and you give me some of Jordan, Jacoby Myers, this isn't a team lacking in weapons in a sense. And I understand the quarterbacks aren't necessarily exciting, but you watch Jake Browning be able to move the ball pretty consistently. Watch Nick Mullins move the ball in Minnesota, for God's sake. Like, if you have weapons, you can actually push the ball, move the ball if you have a decent coordinator or a guy who's just at the the offensive coordinator side.
Yeah, but you're an offensive mind in the 21st century. Chris, real quick, I like this comment coming in from Dynasty World Fantasy Football, and thanks for tuning in, by the way. He was disappointed the Cowboys signed McCarthy in the first place, so was I, and then even more disappointed that they decided to keep him. The only silver lining I can offer you, Dynasty World Fantasy Football, is that I know we made a big deal about the Cowboys having a good draft, but all in all, their offseason was still terrible. They did not improve their team from a season ago. It's a very good chance this team is set up to do similar things to what they did last year, a la lose in the first round of playoffs, because they're not actually that physical. They're not built to do that. They lose Dan Quinn, so we'll see that defense is even as good as it was a season ago. Very good chance, I think, that Mike McCarthy's not going to be there. So shout out to our comment there from Dynasty World Fantasy Football. Good.
Yeah, well, I'm going to defend Mike McCarthy a little bit too. Look, he wasn't the problem for this Cowboy team. Dak Prescott had his best season in a long time. This offense was actually pretty efficient for the firepower of just having basically CeeDee Lamb and Ferguson. So I can't put it all on the coach. What I can say is, Dan Quinn didn't do a great job getting up 40-something points for that Green Bay offense. That helped. That hurt. And I think that there was some moves that Dallas could have made. I would love to see them make a better upgrade. I am not going to argue that at all. But I don't think Mike McCarthy necessarily is a problem. And Mike Zimmer wasn't a bad defensive hire, I think, overall, to replace Dan Quinn either.
All right. Yeah. We'll see.
Look, I feel like Dallas is the same situation where the Eagles are in a sense where I get, the venom, but at least maybe the assistant coaches could be something to help us.
I actually like the comparison from the standpoint of I think there's a similar situation where if the Eagles flop in the second half or if they have an early exit, we're going to see Nick Sirianni gone too. So I think they are in a similar situation. It's a good comparison where depending on how things go, we might be looking at two different coaches at the top of the NFC East next year. Very interesting. Go ahead.
All right, Dan. So moving on to the next part of the offseason, usually we get into the free agency and the trade parts. So what is some free agent moves and trades, these transactions that you see these teams make, or a player that moves it stands out to you that you just have to let them know your agreements with?
So this is a funny idea to think about when, we do fantasy football the way that we do. And you're always, I feel like from a fantasy football perspective, for the most part, the industry is like this too. You're looking for the silver lining in any given move because it had to benefit somebody. Maybe it didn't work out for this guy, but this guy benefited kind of deal. You're looking for that. So it was interesting to kind of check it out from a standpoint of, all right, what was a move that helped nothing? And I don't know if this necessarily didn't help anything, but Gabe Davis going to the Jaguars was super disappointing to me for Gabe Davis and frankly, for the Jaguars, because on the Jaguars side of things, I don't think Gabe Davis gives you anything different than what you had in Zay Jones, who you just cut, or, certainly doesn't improve the Calvin Ridley situation. I think what Calvin Ridley did last year is what you would hope to get out of Gabe Davis this season. And then for Gabe Davis, I don't think this is a situation that unlocks him in any kind of capacity. I mean, maybe the ship has sailed. I know some people are going to say who've been burnt the last couple of years by him. Like, who cares? Move off of Gabe Davis. I get it. I understand what you're coming from. But I wanted to see the guy go somewhere where he might be utilized as more than just a cardio treadmill ex-perimeter receiver. That changes not at all now going to the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's all he's going to be used as. So I felt like this helped nothing. Of course, like I said, always looking for the silver lining. Silver lining on the flip side is, your Dalton Kincaid guy, he's going to get all kinds of target share. Keon Coleman now gets drafted there. I'm sure we'll get to that throughout the summertime. But as far as Gabe Davis and Jacksonville Jaguars go, this helped nothing at all. It doesn't help Trevor Lawrence any kind of way either. So I was down on that one.
Yeah, so you talk about helping nothing at all. The Carolina Panthers spent a lot of money. They made a huge trade getting rid of their defensive end, trading him to the Giants. And this team has improved around Bryce Young, where and how. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the interior offensive line, and yet they're going to have Austin Corbett as their center, who sucks. And then they're going to have two guards who Robert Hunt has some talent, but Robert Hunt was a guy who scored as a pass protector, one of the lower things in PFF, mid-range, average, below average. And the other guy is way below average. And Lewis, I don't know what this team was doing. Seattle was more than willing to give her that guard. They were looking to upgrade somebody, and they went out and gave him big-time money. This isn't going to help Bryce Young get any better. This isn't going to make your number one pick look any better. I have no clue what they're doing when it comes to making their moves. And trading Burns to the Giants, now you have no pass rusher, and you really did what with those picks?
I mean, we can make the argument about Brian Burns and stuff like that. I'll push back slightly on this one. First of all, it wasn't a high bar. Almost anything you brought in would be a little bit of improvement on the offensive line for Carolina. Rob Hunt is an improvement upon what that offensive line had a season ago. And I will say this, bringing Deontay Johnson, that shouldn't be overlooked. That is an upgrade at the wide receiver position, 100%. Drafting Ja'Tavion Sanders, even though he's a rookie tight end, is an upgrade over Hurst, who couldn't give you anything and had concussion issues and head issues. Drafting Jonathan Brooks, as much as I hated the fact that he wound up in Carolina, is an improvement over the running backs that you had there. And I do think Dave Canales is an improvement of a play caller over the combination of Frank Reich and Thomas Brown from a season ago. So there are a number of ways where I do look at Carolina and say, I think they have improved. Now, Chris, to your point, do I think it matters? No, but that's also because I recognize Bryce Young's not really an NFL starting quarterback. So that's the part where I don't know if it matters. But I do think there's a number of ways in which they did improve from a season ago.
Here's where I feel like you had a left tackle in Kawa who shouldn't play left tackle. And if you wanted to improve your interior line, slide him into guard because he'd be a stud at guard. And when you look at the draft picks that they had, there's quite a few guys in those second and third rounds that they could have added an interior lineman, spent a lot less money, and been able to acquire one of these big-time receivers who are going to want $30 million moving forward. Instead, you spent your draft capital moving up and sliding around from the draft yet, but you didn't really put this position where you maximize what Bryce Young's going to bring to your table with that contract we always talk about, rookie contract. Oh, the quarterback rookie contract. Well, what are you going to put around him in the next 3 years? It's not going to make the situation any better. Maybe there's Deontay Johnson was a brilliant move. Pittsburgh, I don't know what you were thinking other than you have Arthur Smith as offensive coordinator, so you're like, why bother having a receiver? But besides that move, with all the draft capital they had and all the money that they had, and in a situation where you already blew a pick trying to get Bryce Young, you got to make this guy look good. There's a lot of different ways I think they could have spent their money and been a hell of a lot better, and including in defense where you don't have to put so much pressure on the offensive score points. I'm not going to, the draft picks weren't that bad, but Brooks, a guy who's coming off with ACL injury, is really going to bring anything different that Chuba Hubbard was bringing to you. Then you're having another receiver. I think Deion Johnson was great, but we're having Jonathan Mingo Part 2 and Xavier Leggett. Like, I just don't see what we're looking for Bryce Young to get better. If you want Bryce Young to be better, get him stud receivers, because that's how you make a quarterback, the guy that he just was coaching before, Baker Mayfield look good. Look how it was with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Look what he looks like without those guys. So to me, that's where we're going to see what Bryce Young's really going to look like, and if that's money really was worth spending.
Sure.
All right. So while we're getting, talking about the draft, what are some things maybe stood out to you in the draft? You kind of shared your point of Carolina, like some of the things that they did, but who should get your scorn, during the draft season part?
Well, you kind of sold us a little bit earlier, but it was Bo Nix at number 12. I kind of purposely passed on bringing up the Michael Penix thing. We've talked about it on the show. It's been talked ad nauseum. That was all the reaction. To me, Bo Nix is almost worse because, well, at least with the Falcons, they have Kirk Cousins. They're set up. I think Michael Penix actually is a good quarterback if Kirk Cousins is not able to go. Bo Nix is not a first-round talent, guys. I don't know how else to break this down to you. He was in college for freaking ever for a reason, because he knew it was never going to go higher than the third round of the draft. Somehow this year he winds up going, gets jacked up to the first round because everybody was just desperate at the quarterback position, had the cutoff there, and got swept up in the hype. I mean, he improved his game in Oregon from what he was in Auburn. Yes, he did. Yes, he is a processor, but you shouldn't be chasing Brock Purdy in the first round. Brock Purdy was Mr. Irrelevant for a reason. And I feel like that's what they did. They chased Brock Purdy in the first round. This means I know what kind of offense you're going to be. It's a game management, conservative type of offense. It's not going to be high flying. It's going to be in the bottom tier of scoring. And as a result of this, I think you're going to be looking at yet another bust. The Broncos have never in their history drafted a franchise quarterback. Remember, the Broncos did not draft John Elway, people. They have not drafted a franchise quarterback that was ever successful in their history. I don't think that changed, and you just spent your 12th pick capital on this guy, a team that doesn't have a lot of draft picks to begin with because of what they gave up for Russell Wilson, who then ran him out of town to pay him $40 million on top of it. So I know we talked about it a little bit earlier, but I just have to pound Bo Nix in the first round of the Broncos. Really, really not a good look.
I think that's an excellent one. The Broncos are just not looking good for us in our opinions. We're not very keen on what they've done this offseason and last season. Is anybody have a question here, Dan?
Oh, we got a comment coming in from Tyler Bradley. Troy Franklin was the real get for Denver. That might be true because he actually did come in at good value, but I don't know. But he does have the chemistry with Bo Nix. I get all that, but it doesn't really matter if it's going to be right next to the line of scrimmage in the NFL. It's not the same as college. You can't just rip that ball off and go against the Pac-10 corners. So we'll see what happens.
You better be careful too, Dan. If he has a good game, he probably gets benched for a while in Sean Payton's place as well. So it's nice to see.
Second Marvin Mims took one to the house. You're on the bench. You're on the bench. Just too good for us. What was yours?
So for mine, Dan, it was kind of a similar thing in the quarterback situation. I understand they get a quarterback, but the draft capital they just spent in general this draft was just ridiculous to me. The Minnesota Vikings, I don't know what you had to do. Look, Dallas Turner better turn into a superstar because you basically gave up the draft capital that you're going to get a quarterback, and then you got J.J. McCarthy, who I just don't see being the answer for your offense. I know I talked about coaches being great and how they can bring average to below average players to up speed with a good offense and good surroundings, but I just do not like this move moving forward. I think the Vikings could have done much more with the draft capital they had. They spent a lot of picks, and they're not going to have an easy time getting better next year. They spent a lot of money in free agency on defensive players, so things better work out real well because moving next season, you got no picks, and you don't have a lot of cap space. So I'm not big on what Minnesota did in the draft.